Equality. Wide skies.
That stereotype coming in there, you don't know unless you let someone try.
The world of work completely changed while I was off sick.
How do we become more disability positive and counter ableism? What does ableism look like in practice? What are the current attitudes like to disability and life-changing or impairing conditions, including hidden and newly emerging ones? How can we be better allies to disabled colleagues and loved ones? And how might employers support their disabled employees better? Welcome to Wide Skies. I'm Martin York.
And I'm Debbie Watt.
I'm delighted to introduce our guests for this episode. Firstly, Nimerta Virdee. Nimerta is an educator, having taught in secondary schools and further education for 11 years, and now is part of the education team at Diversity Role Models, a charity that specialises in bringing LGBT+ inclusion to schools and colleges through the power of storytelling. She speaks openly about her mental health to raise awareness of this hidden disability, which is impacting an increasing number of people in our communities and workplaces. And Dr. Judith Grant. Judith is an experienced workplace wellbeing strategist with a doctorate in occupational health psychology. Through her professional work and lived experiences, she has an in-depth understanding of accessibility issues and attitudes to hidden disabilities. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I'd like to start with asking, for those who are less familiar with the word, what does ableism mean?
There's so many definitions of ableism, but it's essentially discrimination in favour of able-bodied people. So Wikipedia defines ableism as discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities or who are perceived to be disabled.
I think ableism is not one we talk about all the time, but I think it's an important one to get into our consciousness.
It's a term that I've only become familiar with recently, even though I've been working on, making workplaces more inclusive. Actually, it's not a term that I tend to use in my day-to-day. So that's why, I did a fair bit of reading around it to try and understand it.
And a question to you next, Nimerta. What stereotypes are there around disability?
I guess the big one, and actually with my education role at Diversity Role Models, we do a lot of talking about stereotypes with the children. And it's interesting how they have quite a lot of them ingrained. And I think when it comes to ableism, the one that they come out with is just being less able to do stuff, being not as good as able-bodied people. So if I think about it from my own perspective, it's a bit, my disability is mental health related, and so sometimes it can be a bit harder to kind of assign where that prejudice comes in, but it's really that idea of, particularly in the workplace, could even be in study, but that I'm less able, my intellect or my ability in those roles is not as good because of the condition I live with. And in terms of, I guess, physical disabilities or disabilities that are less hidden, it's things like when I talk to the young people, can a disabled person do sport? And it's brilliant that we've got things like the Paralympics now that's so visible, and that's really starting to break down those stereotypes. But, if there's a young person in a class who really, really wants to get into football, do we have those systems set up for them in school that they can go and be part of that team if they want to? How are we making sure that, I know we'll probably talk a little bit more about the social model of disability later, but how are we making sure that actually as a society we're not disabling people, we're ensuring that they can be a part of everything, because they could be just as good. It's again, that's that stereotype coming in there. You don't know unless you let someone try.
Indeed.
I would guess, Judith, there are probably some other stereotypes that come to mind for you as well.
So I'm dyslexic. So one thing I struggle with sometimes is topics under pressure.
Apologies.
Yeah.
So actually linking in, listening intently to what Nimerta was saying, that you ask me a question and I go blank. And actually in the workplace, that can be quite challenging because people look at you and think, oh gosh, well, you might not be good at your job. That might be the perception that you can't do your job effectively. And no, it's just that sometimes I get flustered under pressure. And things like, so I had long COVID for a long time, which we mentioned, you mentioned in the kind of preamble. So I was off sick for 2 years. As I started to kind of get better, people would say, oh, you look really well, and would make assumptions based on my appearance. And it's only because perhaps on those days I had the energy to put makeup on, or it made me feel better to wash my hair that day because I had the energy. But again, it's those perceptions of people looking at me think, oh, well, you look fine, you can't possibly be ill. But they're not seeing the whole of you, or what you're going through. So it's those hidden disabilities. And I think in the workplace that can be really, really tricky, certainly with line managers perhaps who aren't as empathetic as they could be, or just don't have the confidence to support people in the way that they need.
There are also connections between A, looking at somebody and making a snap judgment as to whether you think they're disabled or not, and B, having stereotypes. Every time I deliver training, I talk to people about, if I say the word disability, what comes to mind? And invariably people will say an image of somebody in a wheelchair, because it's the ideogram that we use for pretty much all of our signage in the UK. But of course, that isn't the be all and end all of disability. The other thing that struck me as well is sometimes people get judged for things like, if you're in a wheelchair, then you must use it 24/7. And if you can stand up out of a wheelchair, then somehow you're miraculously recovered, or you're somehow faking it. Or if somebody is blind, then they shouldn't be able to see anything at all. And there are so many varieties and the spectrum of different disabilities and how they might come and go and affect us in different ways as well. Debbie, you were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2015, if I remember right.
Yeah.
Could you give us a bit of an insight into what the condition is and how it impacts on you?
MS is an autoimmune condition. And so this is where your own immune system attacks the coating that protects your nerves, the myelin, in your brain, in your spinal cord, and in your optic nerve. This basically slows down the electrical signals in your brain, which can affect thought, vision, movement, and sensation. I was lucky enough to have some disease-modifying treatment called Nimerta. I had 2 courses, 2 infusions, delivered for 5 days, separated by a year, in 2015 and 2016. And I've been monitored for the past 5 years. And so far, there are no new lesions, which is great. The type of MS I have is relapsing and remitting. So that's where, you're fine, and then you can have a relapse. And that's when you have the active attack from your own immune system.
Right.
There is a primary progressive MS, which you don't have the remissions.
So it just gets progressively worse, yeah?
Progressively worse, yes.
Right, okay.
So I count myself very lucky. I haven't had a relapse for a lot of years, and there was no new lesions on my MRI. But I do still have symptoms. I have periods of brain fog, fatigue, and frequency to pee, which, just it all takes a little bit of pacing and planning, really.
I guess there are some superficial parallels between that and long COVID in as much as it sort of comes and goes in waves, and it may affect you on different days in different ways.
Yeah, definitely.
With long COVID, it seemed like a very cruel illness, because you'd suddenly think, oh, I'm getting better, brilliant, I can do a little bit more. And then suddenly, for no reason whatsoever, you couldn't understand why, you'd crash and then, be unable to get out of bed for a few weeks until you kind of improved a bit. And for me, I was off sick just over 2 years. I did attempt to go back to work a few times, but I just simply wasn't well enough. But I thought I was at the time, but I had relapses, not necessarily brought on by work, just whatever was going on. I think one of the challenges with long COVID is it's not really understood yet. There's no
not at all
really agreed treatments for it yet. I mean, you can treat some of the symptoms, and there are long COVID clinics set up across the country, and internationally there are various long COVID clinics. I think in some ways there's a challenge in terms of people accessing that support. I'm fortunate I had private medical insurance. The clinician I saw to help me with my long COVID wasn't covered under that, and I paid for it. And I'm very, very, very lucky that I was able to pay to get that support. And I went back to work, and I am not fully recovered, but I'm able to function incredibly well now. The final frontier for me is exercise, but actually the brain fog, the fatigue, my face swelled up at one point. I had massive facial swelling quite randomly. They didn't know why.
Goodness.
So I was in agony for months and months and months. And I had heart issues as well. So I went to A&E 7 or 8 times thinking I was having a heart attack. Just really quite random symptoms. And as I say, I feel very lucky I was able to get the support that I got, and my GP believed me, and that I think is very important. I had these sort of advocacy from my GP and the support to get the onward referrals, whereas I know a lot of people with long COVID simply aren't getting the support because they're not believed. Some people still think that long COVID isn't actually a thing, but the Office of National Statistics is saying there's 1.8 million people in the UK at the moment estimated to have long COVID. 21% of those people have had it for over 2 years. So like with other relapsing, remitting conditions, being in the workplace can be challenging because actually you don't know from day to day how you're going to be. It makes it difficult for you as an individual, but also for your employer as well, because how do you support someone with a condition where you don't know what's going to happen with it?
I think I'm right in saying that there has been a recent test case to demonstrate that long COVID is perceived to be a disability under the Equality Act in Great Britain. So at least we now have a precedent for moving forward with that. But of course, that doesn't provide the practical steps for what employers might do. And I guess this is very much avoiding to the unknown for everybody that's involved.
I think it starts with having good conversations, quite simply. So my line manager was pretty good. So while I was off sick, he kept in touch every month to find out how I was. When I went back to work, I had support from, I had an occupational health referral, and I also worked with a return to work specialist. I was also supported by Debbie, actually, which was fantastic, because, the psychological challenge of returning after being off so long was a real big thing for me. But for organisations in general, it's being able to have those open conversations. So if you've got a good relationship with your line manager, you don't necessarily need an occupational health referral. Actually, it's having an open conversation. What can I do to help you? What do you need? Not making assumptions, because everyone's experience of this illness might be different. And I think it's the same with any condition, actually. If you can have an open conversation, maybe use a toolkit. So, for example, Mind have got a really nice wellbeing passport, wellbeing action plan, I think it's called. And I know there are various types of passports, like reasonable adjustment passport, those kind of things that are available, all sorts of great templates that people can use. And having a templated conversation to say, okay, so what kind of support might you need in coming back to the workplace? So are there adjustments that we might need to make? Might they be like physical ones? So do you need to come into the office? If your job is one that's standing all the time, is there actually something you can do where you're sitting? If you're looking at a screen all the time, actually, can you vary those tasks so you're not doing the same thing all the time? For me, being on Zoom calls, because I'd been off for 2 years, the world of work completely changed while I was off sick. And suddenly I came back and I was like, I have no colleagues here in my spare room, and I'm talking to everyone on Zoom, and I found it so intense. I just found it too stimulating. So for me, it was about limiting the number of conversations I was having through the day, so I didn't become overly fatigued in that way. And then there are, the kind of systematic things. So being fatigued, it can be really trying to understand policies and procedures in an organisation. Actually, are they as easy to understand and as accessible as they can be?
If you're ill, then the last thing you want to do is to read through a complex policy that you have to navigate your way through. And I had that experience when I was off work with anxiety and depression, to try and work out how to engage with my healthcare provider was quite challenging, and just one extra complication on top that I didn't need. I thought it was interesting, Judith, how you were talking about part of the techniques that are very simple to employ is about having the conversations in the workplace to really understand what's required. Nimerta, if I could come to you to think about your conversations that you have when you speak out about mental health, could I ask you first of all why you choose to speak about your experiences?
My mental health conditions are long-term anxiety and depression, and it's something that started when I was a child. So I've really kind of spent a lifetime getting to know myself. And when you're younger with this, there's sort of a certain level of energy you can put into masking. And I know like the neurodiverse community, neurodivergent community do talk about masking quite a lot. And I feel when I reflect back on myself as a young person, I put so much energy into forcing myself out of bed, even when I wasn't feeling okay. And I managed it for a time until I hit a point where I couldn't manage it anymore. And I was having a breakdown. And when I reached that stage, I went through a process of having a conversation with my employer, which was a sixth form college at the time. I was a teacher in FE. And I think it took about 5 years to really have that conversation in any open way. But it started off with a line manager telling me to not tell anybody because there's too much stigma around mental health. People either won't believe you or they won't think you're a good enough teacher. That's kind of what I kind of lived with for a little while. So it went back to me trying to put a lot of effort into masking. So got to a point where I was really hitting a wall and needing to take time off. And at that point, HR got involved. And actually, I was in front of another member of staff that was better trained. And I opened up to them, and it was them that said, don't keep this to yourself. You know, we're here as an employer to look after you. I struggled to define what I had as a disability for a long time, because I felt like when you look at the Equality Act and the way that a disability is defined, it's hard to know sometimes whether mental health can fall part of that. But actually, again, looking back at that definition, what I have is long term.
Yes.
It can have, when I'm not well, thinking about this ebb and flow and this unpredictability, when I'm really not well and I'm hitting that wall, it can have a significant effect on my ability to kind of do everyday tasks. So having that advocacy from a person in the workplace was great, but it made me realize just how hidden what I was going through was. And I knew a lot more educators that were suffering with their mental health. It is something that's
It's
sort of
really common.
becoming an increasing problem in teaching. Yeah, it was really through my union. So I'm a member of the National Education Union, and we were talking a lot about what sort of support do teachers need to stay in the profession. Now, I say that as somebody that has sort of left formal classroom teaching already, so I actually couldn't stay in the classroom, which is why I work for an education charity now, and it's much more conducive to me being able to give myself those reasonable adjustments. When we talked about it, we realised people just needed a space to talk about what they were going through, so we started holding coffee mornings on a Saturday in a local church, and members, so other educators that were part of the union within that local area, were starting to come down on a Saturday, and there was some really deep conversations that we had, a lot of tears.
Yes.
A lot of people saying, I don't know who to talk to about this. I've been to my doctor and they want me to be signed off work, but I feel too guilty. There's a lot of guilt in the education profession where people feel like if they get signed off work, then they're doing a disservice to the young people that they're educating. And it made me realise that there was a need for more people to talk about their mental health experiences, particularly in the education sector, but obviously in wider society as well. It's probably not just in education that this is a problem, and really for people to kind of see that representation. And the more of us that do, the more confident other people will feel to speak out about what they're going through. I mean, whether you want to identify yourself as disabled or not, if something that you're going through that you can't help, it's kind of a part of who you are at that moment in time. It might be better, at another point in time, or actually, people that have never experienced mental health conditions could experience them at any
Indeed.
point as well. There's that interesting thing about disability as an identity is that anybody could become disabled at any point in their life. You might be born able-bodied, but it could be, rather than, like I think about myself as a South Asian person, I was born South Asian and that's who I am, but actually disability is something that people can acquire. And it's for me, that's the main reason why I speak about it, is just to provide that representation. In short, that was quite a long explanation.
It was needed. Mental health, we're talking about it so much more now, which is so good. Before it was very much, oh no, not very many people would ever admit mental health problems. That we need to talk about it.
I guess it's getting better for men, but there still is very much a stigma attached for men, and you get the man up toxic expression that comes out. There was something that you said there, Nimerta, as well, about people being frightened to talk about it because of the concerns about being off work. And I was reading a report last year from CIPD, which was saying about increasing amounts of presenteeism that are taking place where people are frightened to be off work because of ill health, and typically because of mental ill health. That's really concerning, I think, for any employer, because if you've got somebody in the workplace, you want them to be productive, to feel well, to have a sense of their well-being, and so having that happen really is quite a sad situation for us all to be in as a community, I think.
Sometimes, you run that risk of not being believed, or you look okay. I mean, my mental health conditions don't always mean that I'm bedridden. But it doesn't mean that I'm okay. And so people might look at me and say, well, you don't look like you're suffering from depression right now. You've got up, you're here today, so you must be fine. And, I've said I was supported in a job, but actually part of the reason why I don't teach anymore is because I moved to another job where I wasn't supported. And, when I asked for some time off or said that that's what I needed, I was told that I shouldn't be a teacher anymore.
Gosh.
So, if this is happening in the workplace, I can really understand why there's a fear about taking time off.
Maybe 10, 15 years ago, workplace wellbeing programs were very much driven, if organizations had them, were driven around sickness absence. So they're chasing absence numbers, and that's a lagging indicator. In organizations, if they're just chasing that metric, there's a pressure for individuals to show up and for line managers to kind of force individuals to show up to work. You should be looking at your presenteeism stats. So if you're forcing people to come to work when they're struggling through whatever it might be, and they don't feel they have the support, they might leave eventually. So you're going to lose potentially a really good individual who, if you supported them, they would maybe give you that little bit of extra effort because they think, I work for a great employer. Wellbeing programs for me shouldn't just be about, tokenistic yoga, sushi, apples. Fantastic. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have implemented a lot of wellbeing days, but you've got to look at the broader picture. So in various organisations I've worked with and for, we try and use psychological measures to understand how people are feeling at work. So you have a broader sense of the leading metrics around people's well-being, as well as doing things like awareness raising. So what Nimerta is talking about is so important, actually, is having employees who will say, you know what, I've struggled, or I have a mental health condition, I have physical health condition, disability, whatever it might be, and being willing to step up and talk about that. It makes it okay for others in the organisation. And I think that's important for anyone working in HR, whatever roles, in leadership roles, to encourage that kind of dialogue. Yeah, the more people that speak up, the more it becomes normal. Say normal? What's normal? That's probably not a good word, is it? But the more it becomes
normalized,
yeah,
part of the everyday.
And it is.
It was occurring to me whilst you were describing those things about wellbeing days that I think that there must have been a spike in sales for things like table tennis tables and beer fridges at one point, because every small organisation seemed to buy them. There's a strong drive, particularly in some of the boutique companies, for there to be a strong team culture and team fit. And of course, one of the challenges that you might have there is if somebody is neurodivergent, they may not necessarily have the same sort of social skills, that they may not be interested in playing table tennis on a Friday afternoon or going to the bowling alley or whatever it might be, but that doesn't make them any less capable in terms of the roles that they perform. It's just that their brains are wired differently and how they interpret the world around them is different. And I think it's really important for employers to consider those factors as well when they're trying to design a workplace that's designed to accommodate all.
For everybody.
And in recruitment as well, and selection procedures. So actually I got diagnosed with dyslexia when I was 30, and it was when I absolutely did an awful job at an interview, and they had these selection tests, and I'm not good at doing maths under pressure. At no point in any of my workplace wellbeing jobs has anyone required me generally to do maths under pressure. I'm allowed a calculator or to go away and look something up, but I had to sit these tests and I did absolutely dreadfully. And one of them, I was very fortunate that the employer, we actually had a conversation about it. And I said, well, I don't think that reflects my ability to do the job. But it did prompt me to go away, and I had the tests. And they said, yeah, you are textbook dyslexic. And I kind of had thought I probably was, but I never thought, I didn't think at 30 it was worth getting diagnosis. But actually it really was, because it's a useful tool, I suppose, to have that conversation with the employer and say, that's not an inclusive way of recruiting. You think how many people would not get to jobs, not even be able to try for them because they can't do the tests that may not even be relevant to the role in the first place.
And how many really good people you're going to miss out on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I've relatively recently done a piece of work for a large client who's looking at improving the inclusivity of their recruitment approach, and I did some focus groups as part of that session, and there was one person who I spoke to that was exactly in that situation where they were asked to do a competency test that didn't suit them because they have dyslexia, and it was only because they had a hiring manager that recognised in the conversation that there was a completely different person that they'd met compared to what the test results were, that they took a chance and hired them. And they said exactly the same thing. I've never been asked to do that in a live situation since. And so it's very much an artificial bubble that we find ourselves in when we're in a recruiting situation, isn't it? When we're talking about disability, and particularly hidden disabilities as well, it's important that we start to use the right language and that we understand how to engage properly. And there is always a risk of falling into the trap of sympathy versus empathy. I wonder whether either of you had any observations on that and why it's important.
Because of the stereotyping applied to people with disabilities as being less able, there is this tendency to see them as a victim and this almost infantilizing approach to them. And Martin, you were talking about that people just have different strength a lot of the time. If I come back to that concept of the social model of disability, do you mind if I talk about that a little bit?
Please do.
My understanding of the social model of disability is not that the individual is disabled, but they are disabled by a society that is built only for able-bodied people. And so, for example, people who are neurodivergent, the way that society is built is usually not in the way that they would approach certain tasks or certain ways of assimilating information, or even certain, like, workplace designs. We were talking a little bit about, even how buildings for workplaces are designed. I'm a big bugbear of mine is the open plan office, and that's down to my my mental health sometimes means that I can get very overwhelmed. There's a lot of overlap with neurodivergent disabilities that kind of overlap with anxiety and depression, and it's just that sense of, well, if you can't handle this, then there's something wrong with you, and isn't that something to be pitied? And I guess what it brings me back to is a little bit of kind of the origins of social activism around disability, which is that saying of nothing about us without us. Like, people who are disabled need to have their voices front and center at writing policies on disability inclusion. They need to be the ones saying what they need and how society is disabling them.
And that links back to something you said almost at the start of this, I think, Judith, which was about engaging with people and talking with them rather than at them and making assumptions. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to recognise that we don't necessarily have all the answers and have all the knowledge, and we don't need to, but it's really about how we engage with an open and inquiring mindset to be able to learn from other people, from their own lived experiences.
One useful thing that an organisation can do is actually map the end-to-end processes they have in their organisation. We had diversity and inclusion groups in various organisations I've been, so voices from different groups. Your trade union, if that's relevant for the workplace that you're in. It might be people from health and safety, from HR, from your sustainability teams, frontline managers to senior leaders, but actually get a good group of people, cross-section of people from the organisation together, and think, actually, what is the employee's experience from before they've been recruited to when they leave, and look at that employee journey. It feels like kind of all these sort of buzzwords, but it really is about understanding actually what are the barriers individuals may come up against, whatever their circumstances are, but what are the barriers that they may come up against, and how as an organisation can you make it more accessible and easier for people to navigate their time joining or in that organisation. You talked a bit about the building that someone's in, for example. So my previous job, I worked in the construction sector and became really, really interested in inclusive design, and did a qualification around well building. It's a really interesting concept, but actually looking at the design of the building. So if you're moving to new premises as an organisation, you might want to have a selection of different people working with you, thinking about what needs to happen within that building.
When I talk about the social model of disability, the three lenses that I try to look through are going to be physical environment, and then procedural and operational and attitudinal. And I think those three things really need to be thought about very carefully, because frequently people can be excluded through inaction or the repeated inappropriate use of language. And I think most people want to do the right thing and say the right thing, but they sometimes don't know what that looks like. I guess that brings us to a question around, there are some types of disability that might be harder to talk about than others because they're sensitive topics. So we can think of, MS might be one, HIV, cancer, those sort of things. How do we have appropriate conversations around them? How do we equip people to be able to talk empathetically and appropriately?
I guess the label of the condition, it can sometimes strike fear into line managers. So one of the things I've done with organisations is we introduced a Conversations for Health module for line managers. So the training focuses on having positive conversations, whatever the condition, because actually if there's the trust there between the line manager and the individual, often the individual is going to know an awful lot about their condition. Generally, people go away and if they've been diagnosed with something, they'll read up on it in general, I would say. And actually they can tell the line manager an awful lot about what's going on for them, and then have that discussion around any kind of adjustments that might be needed. Awareness campaigns are really, really important in the workplace. So whether that's around raising conversation of mental health, whether it's World Cancer Day or whatever the conditions might be actually offering forums for people to talk about whatever they want to talk about. So we like Time to Talk Day is a great one. And then there's World Mental Health Day, for example, where in organisations you might have tea and talk sessions, or I obviously don't advocate just having one day a year to talk about these things, but it might be on a Friday you have like a drop-in session where people can just have a chat and talk. I think Nimerta mentioned something about having kind of chat sessions earlier, and obviously it's important to raise awareness of conditions, but I don't necessarily think that the label of the condition is always something that the line manager has to know everything about.
I think things are getting a lot better, and things like emotional intelligence and empathy are being championed a lot more as very important skills to have in the workplace. But we historically have not valued those skills, particularly in leadership. And you mentioned there, Judith, about line management, but actually, having line managers that care about people on a really human level lends itself to then being able to just listen, and as Judith rightly said, that person's going to have the expertise. Sometimes not. I mean, if, for example, if someone's just been diagnosed with cancer, they're probably in a huge state of shock, and it could just be that they need that space and time. I actually recall quite recently I was at the National Education Union's disabled members conference actually, and we were going through different workplace scenarios, and one of them was how to approach a staff member who's going through chemotherapy and has had lots of time off sick. And our kind of shock with that scenario is why is that even being questioned, that they're off sick for having chemo? I mean, so just having these workplaces that are designed around treating people as human beings. I know we've got to balance the actual sort of work of that organisation as well, but the human side of it should come first in my personal opinion. And just thinking like beyond the workplace as well, we need practice talking about sensitive things a lot more.
We do.
The more you do it, the easier it gets. And this is coming from, the work I do is talking to young people about LGBT plus identities and inclusion, and what homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying looks like. And that's a topic that was banned in schools for 15 years. And educators don't have the skill set to talk about that sensitive topic, but they're getting better at it because we're practicing, and we're slowly, trying to chip away at that kind of toxic legacy of not really feeling able to. So I guess just start and have that kind of willingness to kind of try and not feel like you have to say exactly the right thing all the time. That's where empathy comes in again, like understanding that we're all fumbling around.
I think that's so true. Being so fearful to say the wrong thing. People never talked about cancer. With multiple sclerosis, every time you get a character in the film that has a wife who's got MS or gets MS, they're dead by the end of the episode. We need to have some good positive role models that you can see holding down jobs, doing the good things. And so it's important that we all talk about these things.
I think the other thing that I'm really encouraged by relatively recently is that we've seen lots of initiatives that have been in the press and the media about Take Time to Talk is a really good example of that, of having that conversation of saying, are you okay? And we do this great British thing of saying, yes, I'm fine, thanks. And then the conversation ends and saying, are you really okay? So you're opening the conversation up and taking your cue from the other person. I think cancer is a really good example of that. If somebody is at first stage diagnosis, then clearly their whole world is going to have been rocked. And so they might not be in a position where they feel able and want to talk about it. And you take your cue from them, but making sure that door is still open so that when they do want to talk about it, they know that you're there and that you can start to talk about it together.
So just a question to both of you. How do we become more disability positive and supportive as individuals and organisations?
My one tip, if I was to think of the one thing, is if you aren't really, already aware of the social model of disability, Google it. Watch some YouTube videos about it, and I think once you start to reframe the way that you think about disability, but I think that is probably one of the most powerful things is to realise that it is society that is disabling people and not the individual's condition.
For me, I'd say have a look on Scope on their website. There's some really interesting research on there around disability perception, as well as lots of other really useful tools. There was some really interesting things around perceptions of disability, and actually I think reading that I was like, oh gosh, I need to work on what I consider to be disabled and my understanding of ableism as well, even though work in field, but actually there's so much information on there that I think is useful.
If you're an employer, consider taking up the Disability Confidence Scheme. It's free to join. It's run by the DWP. It's quite straightforward, but it does make a difference to be able to provide job opportunities for disabled people. And the other one, just to return to Judith mentioned earlier on about Disability Passport, you can also expand that to become a workplace adjustment passport. So you might use it in ways that it wasn't originally designed for. So, for example, if somebody requires a prayer room, if somebody is going through gender transition, or if somebody might have caring responsibilities. Those are just 3 examples of different ways in which you might be able to use it. So we've come to the end of this episode. It's been a fabulous conversation with both of you. So if I could thank you both, Dr. Judith Grant.
Thank you.
And Nimerta Virdee.
Thank you.
And here's this episode's self-care tip.
White Skies Self-Care.
We all need sleep. It's vital for both our physical and psychological health. For many of us, including me, at times sleep can be difficult, and a good night's sleep can feel hard to achieve. So this tip is 3 things you can do to improve your sleep. They relate to routine, environment, and preparation. REP. Routine. Our brains like things to be boring and predictable around sleep. Having a set bedtime and a pattern of what you do before bed is really helpful. To establish a bedtime, we need to know how much sleep we need. Everyone is different. Adults generally require 6 to 9 hours per night. I like about 6.5 hours. As well as how many hours sleep you need, the time you go to bed will be informed by preferences and commitments. Are you a lark? Do you like to get up early and go to bed early? Or an owl, someone who likes to get up late and go to bed late? Work and family commitments will also affect the time you go to bed. Once you have a time that works for you, you can establish a bedtime routine. It's good to spend about an hour winding down before bed. So when you go to bed, you're sleeping, and you can do activities like reading or listening to music and audiobook to help you unwind. Ideally, you should follow this routine every day, including weekends. Like I say, boring. Next, environment. Make sure where you sleep is restful. Ideally, your bedroom should be used mainly, with exceptions, for sleep. Not watching TV, working or playing computer games, which makes your brain think that that's what you do in this bed. The comfort level for your sleep. Think Goldilocks. You should not be too hot or too cold. You shouldn't have too many pillows or covers. And your mattress should be not too hard or too soft. In other words, just right. And finally, preparation. Lay the groundwork for a good night's sleep. During the day, do get outside if possible. Do be mentally and physically active so you're tired for bedtime. And don't take naps unless you really need to. And if you do have to, limit them to no more than 40 minutes. In the evening, avoid stuff that will keep you awake. Drinks with caffeine such as tea, coffee and coke, or strenuous exercise. So remember to improve your sleep, routine, environment, preparation, REP, and repeat nightly.
White Skies Self-Care.
Thanks for listening. We really hope that you've enjoyed it, and a very big thanks to our guests, Dr. Judith Grant and Nimerta Virdee.
We look forward to catching up with you next time on our other episodes. A reminder of how you can get in touch and how to access the captioned version of this podcast.
Contact us at linktree/wideskies, where you can also find a link to the captioned version of this podcast.
And so it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Going reach 2-2. Have a safe onward flight.
Well-being, inclusion, diversity, equality. White Skies.
A podcast produced and edited by Majoya Consulting in collaboration with Bridgeborn Psychology.